Hardwax oils have become the belle of the ball as far as our wood finishes are concerned, especially here on social media, and for good reason. Hardwax oils, we should already know, they're very easy to apply, they're basically idiot-proof and you can't screw them up. They lend themselves to easier repairability, and generally speaking, I just think they're a lot less complicated and fussy comparative to some of the other wood finishes that are on the market. However, with that being said, there is one flaw that every single Hardwax oil I have ever used suffers from. And to be perfectly honest, you're staring at it right now. The lack of color. It's just kind of boring and bland. So in this video, I'm going to share with you an experience that I had as far as getting this whole process wrong, and then 3 other options that you can go to really warm up your Hardwax oil finish. So stick around. My name is Jared, and this is Vulgar Woodworks. Before I get into the tips that I'm going to offer up, I am going to let you know that if all you are interested in is the argument that I am going to present relating to these Hardwax oils and the various grits that we sand to and how it all shakes out, then skip ahead to this timestamp. Now, granted, you'll miss all of the tips, but you'll have a nice juicy argument to chew on. All right, so before we get into it, I want to make a couple of things abundantly clear. This is not going to be the typical test 10 different types of Hardwax oil finishes to see which one looks the best or which one offers up the most protection. I am not concerned with that at all. Secondly, we are only focusing on bringing out color. How to get the most color out of a Hardwax oil finish with as minimal effort as possible. So no bougie boutique ceramic coatings that we're going to put on top. No need to rush out and grab 25 extra grits of sandpaper. Everything that you need in order to pull this off, you more than likely already have in your shop. So now that we got that out of the way, let's jump into the first mistake that I think a lot of us run into when it comes to selecting which Hardwax oil we're going to use to get the most shine. So the critical mistake that I made early on in my Hardwax oil life, there wasn't a whole lot of information available to us because of, they were new. So we didn't have all these different colors. We didn't have a lot of different product choices. At the time, it was pretty much just Rubio monocoat. And I made a critical mistake. I didn't study the verbiage behind the labeling on these products. So I made the critical mistake of thinking natural was, going to be natural. And it's not. I'll show you in just a second what it looks like. In fact, I needed pure. So many of these companies are going to have different verbiage when it comes to whatever color or sheen, in some cases, you might be after. Some companies will use clear, some companies will use light, some companies will use dark, and it just gets confusing. So the recommendation that I make is very simply, if the company that you're thinking about going with offers you these little samples, buy the sample first before getting invested in a larger volume. Test and tune. Always test and tune before applying to a project that you are hoping is just going to be finished. So with that being said, let's pull over the 2 sample boards that I have finished in natural versus pure, and you can see there is a stark difference. So here are those boards finished with natural and pure. And you can see it's a night and day contrast here. The natural quite literally looks like a board that was pulled from the rack and then just sanded to 220 grit, whereas the pure is this is what we're looking for. We want to really bring out the color of the wood. So there is my quick little overview when it comes to the verbiage behind these wood finishes. Make sure you test and tune so that you don't wind up with that, because that doesn't look good. So the most effective way to really punch up the color is to use none other than de-wax shellac, or sanding sealer, as it's commonly referred to. I like to whip up a very simple 50-50 mix. I use denatured alcohol as my solvent, and that really will thin down that shellac, and that's what we want. We want to be able to layer on one very light coat and then let it do its thing. It'll flash off and dry in less than 10 minutes. You know, when I was applying this to the test pieces, it was a nice brisk day at about 45 or 50 degrees, and it dried in about 10, 15 minutes. It's not that huge of an imposition as far as our time is concerned, but once it's dried, you can then just go right over the top with whatever Hardwax oil you prefer. The nice thing about shellac is that pretty much anything will stick to it, and it will pretty much stick to anything else. So there's no real reason to go over it and scuff sand. Sand to whatever your preferred grit is, and then apply your shellac, and then apply your top coat, I guess, of your Hardwax oil. And bam, you're done. And I gotta tell you, the difference, it's noticeable. All right, so now what we have as far as the layout of our boards. We have 220 with oil, we have shellac, and then oil as a top coat. And if I'm being perfectly honest, I don't really see that dramatic of a difference in the cherry board, but the quarter sawn wine oak and the walnut, they are significantly warmer than their 220 and oil counterparts. So this is a really easy step as far as the application is concerned. It doesn't take all that much time or effort to be able to lay down a thin coat of shellac, give it time to flash off, and then go right over it with your Hardwax oil. But it makes a noticeable difference, and that's what we're after. So I would say at a bare minimum, the next project that you're going to finish with a Hardwax oil, strongly consider putting that thin de-wax shellac underneath before applying your Hardwax oil. Now the next method, I'm going to fully admit it's kind of boutique because it's really dependent upon whatever project you're about to undertake, but that is to bake your wood before you go into the milling process and before you even get to sanding and putting on finish. Now, baking your wood, again, is going to yield you different results based upon the species that you use. Basically, what we are doing is thermally modifying the material. At 350 degrees for an hour, you're not going to see a dramatic change in color, but it is going to be noticeable. And again, that is completely dependent upon which species you're using. A species like white oak that has a higher tannin count in it than, let's say, pine, yeah, the color is going to be dramatically different. Whereas a species like walnut, it may not be necessarily as dramatic a color change as, let's say, purple heart. So, my rule of thumb is work in half an hour increments. And when you see or start to notice a change in color, stop, because it's really easy to overdo this. Also, a couple of protocols here, points of order. Number one, don't think that putting your oven on broil is going to make this process go faster. You've now just created a fire hazard. Low heat, 350 degrees, that's good enough. Number two, work in half an hour increments, and if you need to, pull the boards out and put it next to a normal piece or an offcut of the board that's in the oven to compare color. Number three, do not mill your boards to final size before putting in the oven, because we're baking them. We're going to extract moisture. We're going to create twisting, cupping, warping in our boards, and we want to be able to keep them as thick as possible for as long as possible and then go into the milling process. And what can you expect once you go through your normal finish process? The transformation is, well, chemical, molecular, I guess. It is through the entirety of the board. It's not just surface level, so you're not going to sand whatever darkness you bake into the wood off. So go through your sanding process. Once you get through the milling process, like you normally would, sand to your desired grit, and then put your shellac on, and then put your Hardwax oil over the top. This is a no-brainer, but yeah, it's dependent upon the size of your project. You're not going to be putting like dining table length boards into your oven. It's just not going to happen. All right, the last tip, and this is the one that's going to get me in trouble, but I don't care. That's why this is Vulgar Woodworks. I'm willing to say it. 220 grit sandpaper. This right here is the reason why your Hardwax oil finish looks like trash, because you are quite literally sanding too much. You are taking away the natural brilliance of the wood. You are sanding out any chatoyance that it naturally has. You are closing the wood fibers, so the wood itself is not going to absorb nearly as much finish. And, well, when you're done sanding to this and applying your Hardwax oil, it's going to look about as flat as that looks. Everything up until now has been fairly anecdotal because usually when a woodworker does one of these finish type videos, it's always based upon personal preference. But I didn't want this video to be strictly anecdotal. So what I ended up doing was conducting a very unscientific survey. So in order to make the results as fair as humanly possible, what I did is I found the most nondescript piece of walnut that I had lying around. I resawed the board, I split the boards in half, and then came up with 4 pieces, which I then sanded to the various grits: 80, 120, 180, and 220. And then I applied Rubio monocoat to one side, so that I left one side bare and then could do the second half of the test. I ended up asking my 35 coworkers, and again, that's not a terribly large sample size, but I'd be willing to bet it's 35 more people than you've ever asked. I asked those 35 people 2 very simple questions. Which smoothness do you prefer? And after they had selected their smoothness, I then flipped the boards over and showed them the finish side to then ask the follow-up question. Do you notice any difference in color? Pretty straightforward. So let's get to the results. I have no cutesy B-roll to put into this section. It's just going to be me because, number one, I was already risking 35 HR complaints by asking people how smooth do they prefer their wood. But also, I don't want to record people without their consent. I could quite literally be fired for that. And this YouTube channel, it don't pay my bills. So I'm going to put a graphic up here to satiate your visual needs. 3 people out of the 35 said that they preferred 80 grit as their desired texture, and they all said the same thing. It still felt like wood, whereas the other 3 were too smooth. To each their own. 10 people said that 120 was their preferred grit. They said that the 80 was still a little too rough, but the other 2, 180 and 220, too smooth. So 10 chose 120 grit. 12 people chose 180 grit, and they all said that they couldn't really tell the difference between 180 and 220, whereas 120 and 80 were still too rough for their taste. And finally, 10 people selected 220 grit. Now, with all of that being said, let's talk about whether or not they saw any difference between the color of the various pieces. Interestingly enough, 18 people said yes. And basically, if they didn't come out and specifically say yes, and they just started moving the pieces around to see if this one had a little more red or this one was darker, I counted that as a yes. Whereas if they just stood back from the 4 pieces, kind of tilted their head to the right, squinted one eye, and looked at it and said, no, I don't see any difference, then I counted that as a no. 18 people said yes, 17 said no. Essentially, a 50-50 split. Even in a fairly unscientific, not fairly, tremendously unscientific survey that I conducted, there's still a fair amount to unpack. Now, I'm not going to go into any great detail. I'll let you guys argue the merits of my survey and the results in the comments, but very simply, it's this. If it is quite literally a 50-50 breakdown that some people can tell the difference in color versus some can't, then that automatically makes me believe that I don't need to continue to sand to 220 grit if I am using a Hardwax oil as my finish. But secondarily to that, those of us who are in the business of making things for other people, we need to have samples of the material that we are going to use in that person's project so that they can tell us what their preferred grit is. So that way we're not overcharging them for a whole bunch of labor that they don't want. So a little piece like this may only take a couple of minutes to go through the 4 grits, but a tabletop, for instance, that could be hours that we are overcharging people because we know better. That doesn't seem right. That doesn't sit well with me. If a client is perfectly happy with 120 grit and they don't see the difference in color, then that's where I'm going to stop because that's what the client wants. So again, you guys can argue all you want in the comments about my results or the personal preferences of my coworkers. It's not going to change anything, but the simple fact of the matter is 50% of the people can't tell the difference in color, and a little more than half, no, a lot more than half, said, I don't want 220 grit. So maybe we should stop sanding to 220 grit? I'm going to wrap up here. So, I'm not going to tell you which boards are 220 versus which boards are 120. If you've been paying attention and have a keen eye, you'll probably be able to tell which ones are which. But therein lies the point that needs to be made. We don't have to sand to 220 grit. The only reason we continue to sand to 220 grit is because we've been conditioned to believe that our projects aren't done unless they are sanded to 220 grit. But the 120 versus the 220, there is no noticeable difference in color. There is no noticeable difference in sheen. And you could quite literally be on this side of the camera standing right in front of these, and I don't think you'd be able to tell. Not unless you ran your fingers across them. There's a subtle, I'm going to say subtle, it's not dramatic, but there is a subtle difference in the coarseness of the wood. But I don't think even still that it's so discernible that somebody who isn't a woodworker would be able to say, oh, you didn't sand it to 220 grit. I don't think they'd be able to tell the difference. So I'm going to leave it here. You have a couple of tips as far as the shellac and baking that you can use in order to liven it up. Or if you just want to stick to just applying straight oil, you don't have to sand to 220 grit. I'll let you chew on that. Thanks everybody for watching, and I don't know, maybe we'll see you in the next one. Depends on how mad you are at me for telling you you can stop sanding.